the shepherds of humanity. When wolves come calling.
The Galactic Council chamber fell silent as Ambassador Margaret Chen stood before the assembled representatives of 300 civilized worlds. The Cronovian War Master, his chitinous plates gleaming under the chamber's lights, let out what his species considered a laugh, a sound like grinding metal. The humans send us an accountant. His mandibles clicked in amusement. We face the greatest military crisis in 10,000 cycles, and Earth sends someone who counts coins. Margaret adjusted her glasses, an affectation, really, since human medicine had solved vision problems centuries ago. But she liked how they made her look. Professional. Harmless. Actually, she said, her voice steady, I count a lot more than coins. Act 1, 0:30 to 3 o'clock. The crisis was real enough. The Zeltharian hegemony had conquered 40 systems in as many days. Their military was a perfectly synchronized machine, every ship, every soldier, every weapon calibrated to a doctrine they'd refined over millennia. They didn't just win battles, they made resistance mathematically impossible. The Council had exhausted every option. Diplomacy failed. Military alliances crumbled. Even the vaunted Cronovian fleet had retreated after losing 3 battle groups in a single engagement. That's when Margaret had arrived, carrying nothing but a datapad and a worn leather briefcase. War Master, she said, pulling up a holographic display, how do the Zeltharians pay their soldiers? The Cronovians' eye stalks twitched in confusion. What relevance? Humor me. They issue credits to their warriors bi-monthly, synchronized across all fleets through their central banking network. And their supply chains? Automated. Contracts fulfilled by a network of suppliers across their territory, all payments processed through their treasury ministry. Margaret smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. Then I believe I can end this war in 60 days. Without firing a shot. Act 2, 3 to 6:30. The Council thought she was insane. But humanity had one advantage in galactic politics, they were so new, so seemingly insignificant, that no one took them seriously. No one worried about what humans could do. That was their first mistake. Margaret's plan was elegant in its simplicity. While the Zeltharians had built a military machine of unparalleled efficiency, they'd built it on a foundation of bureaucratic complexity that would make a human government blush. Every transaction, every payment, every supply order flowed through systems designed during their empire's golden age, 6,000 years ago. And those systems, Margaret discovered, had never been meaningfully updated. This is their banking network, she explained to a skeptical council, holographic code streaming around her. 73 million lines of legacy code. They've been patching it for millennia, adding new features on top of old frameworks, until the whole thing is a house of cards. And do you know what I found? Buried in the authentication protocols. The council members leaned forward. A rounding error. A tiny one, from an ancient subroutine. It's been there so long, they've built error correction around it instead of fixing it. Every transaction loses 0.00000003% of its value. The Cronovian War Master slammed his primary manipulator on the table. That's nothing. Insignificant. Multiply it by 73 billion transactions per cycle, Margaret said quietly. Across 40 conquered systems. For 6,000 years. She pulled up another display. That's 14,000 tons of misallocated war materials. 67 billion credits of missing payments. Supply shipments that should have arrived but didn't. Soldiers who think they've been paid but whose accounts are actually short. But not short enough to notice, breathed the Delphinian ambassador. Exactly. Not yet. But what if someone made that rounding error bigger? Act 3, 6:30 to 9 o'clock. The operation took 47 days. Margaret didn't hack the Zeltharian systems, that would have been illegal, an act of war. Instead, she did something much more devastating. She became a vendor. 13,000 shell companies, incorporated in neutral territories, all offering slightly better prices than existing Zeltharian suppliers. Each one completely legitimate, licensed, approved through proper channels. The Zeltharians' automated procurement systems, always optimizing for efficiency, began routing orders through these new vendors. And every transaction included a processing fee. A tiny one. Completely reasonable by galactic standards. Compound that across a military empire, and things began to fall apart in interesting ways. Supply shipments were delayed by hours, then days. Not cancelled, just late. Late enough that frontline units ran low on ammunition. On fuel. On food. Payroll deposits were short. Just a fraction of a %. Not enough to complain about once. But month after month, soldiers began to grumble. And then Margaret's piece de resistance. She found the Zeltharian logistics AI and gave it a present, a optimization patch, from a licensed vendor, designed to reduce fuel consumption by 0.3%. It worked perfectly. Fuel consumption dropped exactly as promised. But the AI had been trained on 6,000 years of the old fuel consumption rates. Suddenly, its predictions were wrong. Ships that should have had enough fuel to reach the front lines came up short. Battle groups found themselves stranded, waiting for tankers that the AI had determined weren't necessary. The Zeltharian war machine, that perfect instrument of synchronized destruction, began to miss beats. Act 4, 9 to 10 o'clock. The war marshal of the Zeltharian hegemony stood before his command council, antennae quivering with barely controlled rage. "Tell me again," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "how the Third Fleet ran out of ammunition during the Clandros assault." "The supplies were delayed, Marshal. A processing error in the... And the 5th Battle Group's fuel shortage. An optimization patch that apparently... And why 17,000 soldiers have filed pay complaints in the last cycle?" Silence. "We are being attacked," the Marshal said, "and I cannot see the enemy." "That's because the enemy was Margaret Chen, sitting in a rented office on a neutral station, surrounded by holographic spreadsheets, drinking her 7th coffee of the day. The War Master found her there when the Zeltharians finally sued for peace. You brought down an empire with accounting," he said, something like respect in his grinding voice. Margaret looked up from her work. "Not accounting. Bureaucracy. You know what your problem is? You all think war is about weapons and soldiers and tactics. But war, real war, runs on logistics. On supply chains. On systems so boring that nobody pays attention to them until they break." She stood, gathering her things. "Humans learned that lesson the hard way. We spent our entire history fighting each other before we reached the stars. We know that you don't beat an enemy by being stronger. You beat them by making it too expensive, too complicated, too frustrating for them to keep fighting. We made them tired," the War Master said slowly. "We made them realize that conquering galaxies is a lot harder when you have to worry about whether your soldiers are getting paid on time." She smiled. "War isn't won by heroes, War Master. It's won by accountants, logistics officers, and supply clerks. We're just the first ones to weaponize that fact." Epilogue, 10 to 10:30. The Zeltharian hegemony collapsed within a year. Not from military defeat, but from administrative paralysis. Their bureaucracy, optimized for millennia for war, couldn't handle the cascading inefficiencies Margaret had introduced. Systems crashed. Officers resigned. Conquered worlds realized their overseers couldn't pay the troops keeping them occupied and simply stopped cooperating. As for Margaret Chen, CPA, she returned to Earth, hung her ambassador credentials on the wall next to her accounting license, and went back to running her small tax preparation business. But the galaxy learned a lesson that day: humanity might not have the biggest fleets or the most advanced weapons. But they had something far more terrifying: they understood the power of paperwork. And they weren't afraid to use it.